So it is 3:30, and I want to thank you all for coming. And I wish we were in formal session in the wonderful room in Thompson where we normally start our events, but we are not. We are here on Zoom, and but I want to welcome you all to the opening session, the opening event of. I think we are the 8th or 9th. I've lost track. I mean, 8th. Two-year program for the OSU CHR Center for Historical Research. And our topic this year is Crisis, Uncertainty in History, Trajectories and Experiences of Accelerated Change. And we are very much afraid that this is a topic of perhaps too much salience in our lives in the 21st century. As a graduate student put it last week, have we been in a state of crisis since 9/11? There were some dark mutterings around the room asking whether the entire state of modernity has been a permanent condition of crisis and uncertainty. Now, painfully aware of these longer perspectives, our thinking and planning for this program began back in March of 2020, in the early weeks of our sudden collective experience with COVID-19, as we collectively began to process the impact of unchecked epidemic on our own lives and on global society. I don't think we really knew what would lay ahead. Last spring and summer, the sudden immediacy of crisis and uncertainty was redoubled with the events unfolding from the murder of George Floyd, the election struggle and its aftermaths, and now the devastating annual impacts of fire and hurricane coming with the sudden collapse of the Afghan government to the Taliban. Today, 18 months later, on the 10th of September, we think back finally to the seeming normalcy of this day 20 years ago and on the shock of the morning after that. These have been the context of our inquiry, and we take our subject to include the problems and dynamics, and the experience of crisis on a global historical stage. How do crises erupt? How are they grounded in sudden exogenous ruptures, earthquakes, fires, hurricanes, natural disaster writ large? How do they interact with human choices accrued over longer and shorter periods, practices and policies that seem to work, or that work to the advantage of certain interests in societies? How are wars, economic crises, and national constitutional crises embedded in both the tangles of global history and the construction of public discourses about national purpose and policy? How do people experience the dynamics of crisis, the uncertainties for the future that they force into view, and the choices that have to be made for better or worse? These are problems that historians wrestle with in all of our work. They're also problems that anthropologists, sociologists, and economists and climate scientists have been working on for years, establishing theoretical frameworks that we will be interrogating over the next 2 years. In bringing together a diverse group of scholars, we hope that we will provide a useful forum for an interdisciplinary conversation, a transdisciplinary conversation about crisis within and beyond the OSU at large. Now, as the director of the CHR and the chair of the program, I would love to extend my thanks to the tireless steering committee, especially our vice chair, Joan Cashin, all of whom will be called upon for a few more decisions in the coming months. I would also like to extend our thanks to our generous co-sponsors of the program and its events, the Department of History, the Global Arts and Humanities Discovery Theme, the OSU Office of Diversity, the Institute of Chinese Studies, and the Department of Anthropology. In history, I particularly want to thank the departmental staff, Laura Seeger, Chris Adams, and Steve McCann, providing the behind-the-scenes support that makes these programs run and flourish. Scott Levi, chair of the department, has made sure that our efforts go forward in this, our time of troubles. Let me also take a moment to welcome our postdoctoral scholar, Julia Kablinska, recently awarded her PhD in East Asian Studies at Berkeley. She occupies a position funded by the Global Arts and Discoveries Humanity Theme, hosted by the Department of History, and reporting to the CHR, the East Asian Studies Center, and the Center for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. That's many points of reporting. So one final housekeeping note. I really want to remind you all that you can register for our events on the CHR website, which write it on the web, and or just email to me, John Brooke, brooke.10@osu.edu. Now, today we extend a very warm welcome to our series launch speaker, Roberto Barrios, professor of anthropology at the University of New Orleans. He may be a little sick of warmth. He is here today as a participant observer until a few days ago, a climate refugee set adrift by Hurricane Ida, but now home, literally home, with a stable internet connection, we hope. He will present his perhaps personal thoughts on a crisis for whom epistemologies, historiographies, and praxis in a time of upheaval. And I suspect that he may have a few intempered opinions after surviving the last 10 days. I've asked our steering committee colleague, Jeff Cohen in the Department of Anthropology, to introduce Professor Barrios more fully. But let me just lay out the plan for today. Professor Cohen will have a few words of welcome. Professor Barrios will then have about 45, 50 minutes to lay out his thoughts. And then we're going to open the floor for questions. So if you have a question, post your name in the chat. Why don't we post to everybody so that everybody sees what's coming up in the questions, and tell me your name and tell me, if you can, the thread or the topic that you want to pursue. And I'll call on you, or Jeff will call on you to make a quick and cogent query, perhaps not too much grandstanding, generally in the order of your request, but we're going to say pay some attention to the lines of inquiry. Follow-ups are welcome, but we want to balance conversation with inclusivity. Obviously, mute your mic when you don't have the floor, and I think we're good. So let me hand over the mic to Jeff and take things from there.
Thanks, John. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone. And I thought we were moving away from Zoom heads, but I guess not. So we're all still here. So welcome, everybody. I'm Jeff Cohen. I'm a professor of anthropology here at OSU. And it is just a real honor for me to introduce our speaker and my friend, Dr. Roberto Barrios, today for his talk. So Dr. Barrios is a professor of anthropology, and he's the Doris Zemuri Stone Chair for Latin American Studies at Tulane University in New Orleans, Louisiana, where I guess it's just been a little wetter than normal. So we'll hopefully that won't get in the way. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Barrios and his work. His degree is from the University of Florida, and that's one of our field's leading departments, one of anthropology's leading departments. And he developed a very broad focus in anthropology that was based on research throughout the Americas, including the US Gulf Coast, and emphasizing the study of crises and disasters that are environmental and social. And one of the most important pieces of that work was documenting disaster survivors with special attention to social inequalities, competing ideas of what was successful recovery, and the long-term impacts of recovery plans on local populations. And I can just give you one very brief example of what this means. Writing on Hurricane Katrina in the online publication of the Venner Grant Foundation called Sapiens, Dr. Barrios asked, how will recovery practices on the part of governmental organizations and nonprofits engage and assist New Orleanians who are the most severely impacted by the disaster? And he goes on to note that the collection of reconstruction experts and managers who work for or are subcontracted by disaster relief agencies usually arrive at affected localities with their own ideas about what constitutes rebuilding better. The rigid applications of their best practices, however, can effectively prolong the disasters for those who suffer the brunt of a catastrophe. So defining the value and the importance, as well as the strength of anthropology and ethnographic methodologies in the study of crises and social inequalities is clear in that statement. And it's also clear in all of the work that Dr. Barrios has done. And this includes his recent book, Governing Effect, Neoliberalism and Disaster Reconstruction that was published with the University of Nebraska Press, and just an outstandingly interesting and important number of articles on risks, on disaster, and most recently on COVID and the pandemic. So it's wonderful to be able to welcome Dr. Barrios today, and I hope you will join me in taking from his talk, which is titled Crisis, Uncertainty, and History, Trajectories and Experience of Accelerated Change. Or I guess it's a little different on there, so.
I apologize for the hound dog in the background. We'll try to keep him as quiet as possible. But I would like to begin by thanking John and Jeffrey for this amazing invitation. And yes, I do feel a little bit cheered by the pandemic that I cannot be there in person, but also I think we have all found out all the things that this digital format enables. So there's also good things making it less impactful on our environment by not having to use airliners for travel, and also being able to spread our resources and do more academic activity. So not all is bad. And also thank you very much to the steering committee for the opportunity to be a part of this amazing experience that from the conversation that I had with students earlier today, I gain as much, if not more, through my engagement with your graduate students and your faculty. So let me get to the heart of my talk. A Crisis for Whom? Epistemologies, Historiographies, and Praxis in Times of Upheaval. And I'll start with a little bit of a background anecdote on why I'm even talking about crisis. And truth be told, had it not been for an invitation from the Annual Review of Anthropology to write on a topic, I would have probably never engaged it. So if I travel back to 2013, before the Annual Review of Anthropology reached out to me to see if I wanted to write an article on the topic of crisis and disasters, I would not be here. And it's interesting because this topic of crisis and disasters, I had a longer history with, but it was this invitation that really forced me to fully engage the subject. As Dr. Cohen mentioned, I wrote this book, Governing Affect, and one of the case studies is a multi-sided book project. One of the case studies was my dissertation research that I conducted in southern Honduras in the aftermath of Hurricane Mitch. And one of the things that emerged out of that research was that the receding of floodwaters after a hurricane and the cessation of rainfall and the arrival of disaster aid didn't mark the end of the disaster, for at least for the people who live in the research site where I conducted my PhD research, which was the largest housing relocation site in southern Honduras that went by the name Limón de la Cerca. And one of the things that impressed me through my qualitative research was that in the narratives that I elicited from disaster survivors, the disaster had not only not ended, but had actually been exacerbated through the types of policies and practices of disaster recovery applied by local government, international NGOs. So this idea that the disaster had not receded, for when I wrote the title to my dissertation, of course, as a graduate student, I wrote something maybe too poetic and flowery and overextended. And the title of my dissertation was Flying Rooftops and Matchbox Houses, the Semiotic Material Production of Crisis in Post-Mitch Honduras. So I used that word crisis in my dissertation title. But when it came time to defend my dissertation, I was very fortunate to have one of my mentors be Dr. Anthony Oliver Smith, who is recognized in the US as one of the founding figures of the field of disaster anthropology in the United States. And prior to this invitation by Annual Review, he had written the first Annual Review of Anthropology article on the subject of disasters. He had written that in 1996, and my article will be coming out 20 years afterwards. So when I was sitting in that room to defend my dissertation, Tony, as he likes to have his graduate students call him, took me to task because I had used the word crisis in my title, and I used it recurringly throughout the text of my dissertation, but I never really explained what I meant by that term, or nor did I examine the cultural history or the history of the concept itself. So if it was one of my key heuristic devices or analytical devices in my title, why did I not open it up for examination? And in the fact that I had written the dissertation as if what a crisis is was self-evident to the reader. And I was not prepared to answer that question, and I would not be prepared to answer that question for possibly another 18 years. So when I got this invitation from Annual Review, I thought I would reach out to my network of disaster anthropologists because Annual Review of articles, people want to be cited, people want to be recognized, and I wanted to make sure I didn't miss anyone. So I reached out to several email listservs for disaster anthropology, reaching out to friends and colleagues, telling everyone, hey, I've been invited to write this article. And particularly if anyone has written on the subject of crisis, in relationship to the anthropological study of disasters, please send it to me because I want to read it and I also want to cite it. And I was a little bit surprised that I did not necessarily receive a very welcoming response to that prompt for citations. I received an overwhelmingly critical response on the part of my colleagues, which leads us to the title of this particular slide, is Crisis Good to Think? And the overwhelming response that I received from my colleagues was that crisis was not good to think, especially when it came to disasters. So some prominent anthropologists said, we already have too much jargon in disaster anthropology. Crisis doesn't really fit the study of disasters. It's just more jargon. It doesn't really explain much. And I did hear back once again from Tony, and Tony articulated a question or a recommendation for a course of analysis that he had done so 16 years or 18. I defended my dissertation in 2003 and 2004. I defended it twice for reasons that I'm not going to mention right now. So 15 years earlier. And the recommendation he made was, well, you have to go back to classical Greece, and that's where the history of the concept begins. But he couldn't offer necessarily much more than that. So feeling a little bit frustrated that within the field of disaster anthropology, I couldn't find the tools and the information that I needed for thinking about the subject, I decided to branch out to broader anthropology in general and to see what anthropologists had written about crisis. And in a little corner of the internet, in an online journal called Political Concepts, I found what I was looking for. I found a really nice article written by Janet Reutemann, who also wrote a book titled Anticrisis on the subject of crisis, and offering suggestions as to where to look to understand the history of that concept. And Reutemann recognizes that in the field of Western scholarship, and I have to recognize here the Eurocentrism of that lineage, and I think that there's one of the things that we'll be discussing and that we discussed earlier today was the need to maybe diversify that history of concepts, particularly in a post-colonial way, in a non-Eurocentric way, to see how other histories of thought may have conceptualized the types of circumstances that in the West we often call crises. But in the history of Western thought, Reinhard Koselleck, historian of concepts, is often credited with writing the authoritative history. And again, that whole notion of authoritative history is up for challenge. And it just points to the fact that there haven't been too many other studies that go into the archaeology of the concept in as much detail as Reinhard Koselleck has. So for the time being, he holds that credit. And here's what Koselleck laid out. As I read Koselleck's work and I continued to dive into the work of disaster anthropologists, I found out that although a lot of disaster anthropologists claim that crisis wasn't good to think, that the crisis concept, even when they didn't mention it explicitly, was deeply interwoven, or at least the assumptions and the concepts and the very structure of thinking crisis was deeply embedded within the major fields of thought in disaster anthropology, particularly vulnerability theory and the political ecology of disasters. So I found that fascinating. And so now really quickly, for those who haven't had the time to read Koselleck, I just want to go over the major points and then to explore what relevance they have for how we think about crises, or whether crisis is good to think, what are the blind sides that the crisis thinking gives us intellectually, what possibilities does it foreclose for thought, and how to think against the grain, how to think critically and reflexively about crisis and the concept. So as I mentioned before, Koselleck takes it back to the classical Greece, where crisis and krino were used in the medical and legal fields and to denote the idea of a decision or a judgment. In the legal field, a judgment or a decision to divorce or quarrel, and in the medical field, a decision that would either lead to a patient improving or a patient dying. And one of the things that Koselleck points out that's really interesting is that crisis, particularly in its meaning, in its connotation of judgment, is intimately linked to what eventually becomes the 18th century Enlightenment notion of critique. So the idea that critique and crisis are intimately related concepts, and it's something that we're going to see emerges once again in a lot of disaster anthropology and in the way that the concept has been used in disaster anthropology. And moving, and again, broad strokes here, you could write a dissertation, right? Koselleck wrote a couple of books, but you could write a dissertation on each one of these historical periods or moments. But jumping broadly, one of the arguments that Koselleck makes is that this particular meaning, legal meaning of crisis as judgment, eventually becomes a part of the ways in which, for lack of a better word, can we call them proto-historians, or the people who are writing what would stand for history in medieval Europe, the idea of the final judgment takes on this connotation of crisis, particularly from the Greek meaning, the Greek legal meaning. And the important thing here is that this marks the beginning, the origins, the development of what eventually becomes in 18th century historiography, the epochal thought or epochal historiography, the idea that history must be narrated and told in a sense of qualitatively, dramatically different periods of time that have within them particular kinds of subjectivities and ways of being a person, etc., that change through punctuated moments of crisis, crisis then becoming the driving engine for historical change. So particularly this whole notion of the final judgment marking the two different times, the history of humanity, which is a history of struggle and of sin and of redemption or whatever you may want to call it, and eventually leading to this judgment that leads to a qualitatively different temporal moment, the kingdom of heaven, which is the happily ever after of humanity in this divine realm. So that creates the structure of thinking about crisis marking two different epochs. And Koselleck sees that particular notion of epoch emerging out of medieval historiography. There's highly teleological, the idea that we already know the end point of history, it's going to be the final judgment and then the happily ever after. And for Koselleck in 18th century narratives of crisis, we see this structure. We see narrations, particularly within early historians, 18th century historians, seeing moments of crisis and revolt as being moments that mark a dramatic shift in the quality of time, but also that lead to moments of complete resolution of the challenges and the problems of human affairs. So the French Revolution was expected to lead to a happily ever after post-revolutionary life that didn't necessarily turn out the way that was expected. In the same way, the American Revolution was supposed to be lead to this moment, this post-struggle, post-crisis moment that would lead to the happily ever after of American history. And as we know, that's not necessarily what occurred. So one of the things that we see here is a kind of teleological structure of historiography emerging that doesn't actually bear out in practice, but it seems to be very resilient and remain entrenched within ways of thinking about history, but also thinking about crisis, thinking about social theory, and thinking about social change. And the accusation here, or the critique here, remains that that idea remains. So particularly in 19th century evolutionary social theory. So the particular thinker that everyone loves to beat up on, whether it's anthropologists like Johannes Fabian or Michel Foucault or even Koselleck, is that Marx, although Marx claimed that through dialectical materialism, you could see the reality of the world and truly be objective and not have your thought be permeated by ideology, which was the only way for Marx to imagine someone having agency. In Marx's thought, the argument here is by these post-structuralists that although Marx claimed that dialectical materialism will allow you to see history objectively, that in fact Marxist tellings of history remain teleological, but at least particularly for the history of class struggle in Western Europe, the idea that all of these minor crises that were engendered by contradictions within the mode of production and about the class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, these were all minor crises that were dress rehearsals for what would eventually become the final revolution that would lead to the communist mode of production. The communist mode of production being equivalent here to the kingdom of heaven and the happily ever after, the resolution of all social problems. That's why I have here this nice little image, one of my favorite murals from Mexico City in the National Palace of Mexico next to the Zócalo. There is this mural painted by Diego Rivera that narrates the history of Mexico in a distinctly Marxist way. It's a history of class struggles and you can follow the motion of the painting and the dynamics of the painting, the composition of it, to the final revolt of the Mexican proletariat, that is going to rectify ethnic differentiations, class struggles, and it's going to, and here you have Karl Marx pointing to this imagined idyllic future of Mexico, where you see an industrialized modern Mexico where there are no longer any class struggles, any ethnic struggles, and it's a worker's dream. And, unfortunately, that expected future has not come to pass. So again, one of the challenges here with crisis thought is that it enables a teleological type of thinking that is deeply, that has many deeply embedded assumptions about how history is going to turn out. And it's really interesting that thinking in terms of historiography and historical thinkers, a lot of the post-colonialists like Dept, Chakrabarty, and Saurabh Dubey have heavily criticized what they call historicism in certain forms of historiography. The idea that the history of Europe, or in an expected history of Europe, or an expected futurity of Europe, is that of the whole world. So that leads Saurabh Dubey to propose the idea of a historiography that is a history without warranty. And this is an example, I think, of history with warranty, right? This idea that this will happen, this revolt will happen, which has remained deeply embedded within crisis thought. In the early days of the pandemic, for example, I was very curious when commentaries started coming out in social media by public intellectuals and public thinkers. And some of these commentaries were saying that the COVID-19 pandemic was going to once and for all show the inequities and the violences of neoliberalism, and that it would lead to this happily ever after, that this would be neoliberalism's last stand that it could not be able to get beyond. And again, I interpreted that as, once again, this kind of teleological thought, this whole idea of salvation after a particular judgment, after a final judgment, as if the pandemic would be the final judgment of neoliberalism. I've seen other anthropologists like Gastón Gordillo also say that anthropogenic climate change is going to be the one obstacle that capitalism and neoliberalism can't overcome. Again, that teleological thought surfacing once again, that this crisis of climate change is just going to bring this to an end. And that is, to me, more an assumption than a given guarantee. So, well, borrowing a little bit from Dubey, I've been trying to propose the idea of crisis without guarantee, in the same way that Dubey proposes history without warranty, to not assume that a crisis has an outcome that we can easily predict from the get-go. So, but changing, so that takes us up to the 19th century, but what about anthropology? And, one of the things that I think is interesting to mention, and I think that John brought it up when we started our conversation, when we started the introduction today, anthropology as a discipline has forever, at least in the United States, in its formulation, as it was in part founded by Franz Boas, when Franz Boas wrote the Methods of Ethnology in the early 1910s, 1910, 1911, or something like that. He mentioned that one of the key concerns of American anthropology was the study of social change. And it's interesting that Boas develops American anthropology under great skepticism and great concerns about the applicability of social evolutionary theoretical models, in particular as those of Marx. Now, Boas is not saying that Marx is wrong, but in that article, he's saying we just don't have the data. We don't have the ethnographic data to say whether indeed we can fit all groups of people within one unilineal teleological line of human development, or whether something else is the case. And also, we want to understand processes of social change. And I think that will be interesting here, thinking about the relationship between crisis and change. Again, addresses longstanding concerns in many of the social sciences and humanities, including anthropology, history, sociology, etc. So in anthropology, I guess we could look more closely at other authors, but anthropologists like Ida Susser and also Sergio Wysokowski, who have written about crisis, point to this increasing interest in crisis within anthropology, and particularly taking place in the aftermath of the Second World War, particularly among British social anthropologists working in Zambia, working in the Copper Belt, and looking at these processes of social change. The idea that at one point, anthropologists may have upheld the notion of studying the exotic that is somehow isolated from broader global political economy and broader processes of global change. And that possibility, or that fiction of anthropology, begins to fall apart in the post-war period. So Gluckman and Turner becoming very much interested in urban to rural to urban migration, particularly surrounding copper production and the kinds of upheavals and social transformations and crises that brought along. So one of the key elements here that I think is also interesting for answering this question is is crisis good to think? And this is going to be a theme that recurs a lot in anthropological and other sociological discussions of disasters, is whether disaster is a methodologically opportune moment, and not disaster, crisis. In terms of what does a crisis afford methodologically. And it is interesting because as a disaster anthropologist, sometimes I get a little flack from other colleagues. Some people argue, disaster anthropology, that sounds so sensationalistic. Instead of being interested in the quotidian and the everyday lengthy process that anthropologists are historically interested in, you go for the thing that's flashy. But there's been a longstanding interesting argument on the part of anthropologists who look at crises, who argue that crises are methodologically powerful because they allow you to see social fractures, social fault lines, social structures that are much harder to evince and to notice under conditions of so-called normalcy. So, and that begins certainly with Max Gluckman and Victor Turner, where they're both pointing to the methodological merits of looking at crisis. Now, both Gluckman and Turner, where they did recognize processes of social change taking place, but from the commentaries that have been written about their work, it's also possible that, while on the one hand, they were recognizing the changes that Zambian miners were experiencing in people in the copper belt, they also had a tendency in their analyses to push for a certain conservative element to crisis. So on the one hand, crisis offered the possibility of change, but they were also interested in the kinds of social mechanisms through which the forces of conservatism or conservative forces of a particular society attempted to maintain the status quo. So for Gluckman, those were rituals of rebellion, and for Victor Turner, the idea of drama and equilibrium. In a way, yes, they did recognize the potential for change within crisis, but they also took this great interest in, again, how the norm or how a particular society replicates itself. So equal emphasis here on these conservative elements. And I think that's going to be very different from the type of anthropology of crisis that begins to emerge later on with the work of Marshall Sahlins, that especially his mythopraxis and his particular combination of French structuralism, but with Marxist political economy, brings a very different perspective on crisis and its potential for change. So that takes us to another big jump, right? We're jumping from the Zambian copper belt now to Polynesia. And not just Marshall Sahlins, but also the work of Raymond Firth and James Bilius, that in the early 1950s, 2 cyclones had affected the island of Tikopia. And Tikopia was interesting because when ethnographers did research in moments of non-upheaval, non-struggle, there were many narratives and discourses that were articulated by people of Tikopia, for example, concerning reciprocity and the idea of generalized reciprocity distribution of food among members of the kinship group, as well as mutual respect between elites and commoners. And one of the things that was interesting for Firth and Spilius was that in the early 1950s, 2 cyclones hit the island. And a famine follows, a drought follows, and a famine follows. And all of a sudden, all of these discourses and practices of reciprocity change. And so people aren't sharing food within their broader kin group. People are only sharing food within their immediate households. And that's why Sahlins begins to say that there were certain social fault lines or structures. The idea that for him, the household was a fundamental unit of social organization of Tikopia, not the kinship group. But it wasn't possible to see that under conditions of normalcy, and that the crisis itself allows you to see all of these structures that you otherwise couldn't. And that's why Marshall Sahlins begins to popularize the use of the concept of crises revelatrices. But Sahlins is also interested in processes of change. And so he engages in this comparison how, on the one hand, as a historical anthropologist, he had documented the fact that in the history of Hawaii, Polynesian society had moments of upheaval and of outright revolt that, from his judgment, actually resulted in significant sociopolitical change. I mean, there were revolts that got rid of the elites and transformed society. Whereas in Tikopia, that did not occur. In Tikopia, things came close to actually there being an all-out revolt between commoners and elites during the famine of the early 1950s, but it didn't get to that point. So Sahlins is left to hypothesize, why did Tikopia, the case of Tikopia, not result, it was a revelatory crisis, but it didn't result in profound sociopolitical change, and the ones in Hawaii did. And his claim is that the disaster caused or triggered Utopia had been triggered by an exogenous agent, by cyclones that came from outside of society. And for him, the driving mechanism of social change is whether a particular mode of production has reached maturity. And again, that comes from Marx, whether the inherent contradictions of a particular mode of production have reached the point where things explode. And therefore, Salins uses this explanation between exogenous and endogenous sources, driving mechanisms. And he says the crisis of Hawaiian history had made. So really interesting thing for historians, right? What does Salins mean by history? Of course, it's meaning a very specifically Marxist way of conceptualizing what drives history in marking that transition. So this idea of Salins, but one of the interesting things, and I guess one of the critiques of Salins saying that is that Salins is writing, Stone Age Economics comes out in 1973, I believe, 1972, 1973. And it's right before what becomes a transformative article in the field of disaster studies, and it's the article that is the basis of political ecological thought and vulnerability theory in disasters, which is the article in Nature, Taking a Naturalness out of Natural Disasters by Phil O'Keefe et al. That begins to make the argument that would have crumbled Salins' argument that disasters, again, Salins represents the famines of Utopia as being caused by an external agent. In the so-called natural disasters, between quotes, are caused by elements that are external to society. And the vulnerability theory of disasters begins to argue that a hazard alone does not a disaster make. That a disaster is given form and magnitude by human practices that are often engaged in over a long period of time, over a historical political ecology, of people engaging a particular environment in a particular way and creating inequities in access to places that don't flood or places that don't shake too much during earthquakes, as well as shaping socioeconomic inequities that make it harder for some people to be able to live in adequate housing, for example, as well as inequities that determine who can get aid before the disaster or not. So taking a naturalist of natural disasters would have completely crumbled Salins' argument, because they would have argued that this whole idea that a disaster or the crisis of a disaster is caused from outside is erroneous. That there is the interaction of the hazard with a society with a given condition of vulnerability has been created by that society's history that then triggers the disaster. And that would have, in a way, challenged the way in which Salins proposed why certain crises led to change and not others, and would lead us to continue to ask the question, okay, so if the maturity of a mode of production is not the answer as to why change takes place, then what other answers can we come up with? How should we theorize what leads to change or not in relation to disasters, so, or crises in general? So so that's in the 1970s, and it's not until the 1990s that disaster anthropologists and disaster anthropology begins to come into its own in the United States. And two articles, one by Jacqueline Solway and one by Anthony Oliver Smith, use the Salins' concept and reference Salins for referring to disasters as revelatory crises. And again here, Anthony Oliver Smith is once again reiterating this idea that goes back to Gluckman and to Turner, that a crisis is a methodologically opportune moment in terms of what it allows you to see, or a disaster. And Oliver Smith writes, disasters are revelatory crises in which the fundamental features of society and culture are laid bare in stark relief by the reduction of priorities to basic social, cultural, and material necessities. So again, those colleagues who say, you study disasters for sensationalistic motives, the response could be, well, there are also very opportune methodological moments that should not be overlooked. But Oliver Smith goes on, and he also says, and again, although Oliver Smith doesn't, he's using the concept of revelatory crisis, but he also goes in a little deeper in a way, resurfaces, reinvigorates or gives further life to what I would consider a classical Greek meaning of crisis, which is that of judgment. Because he writes, disasters are one measure by which we can judge the success of adaptation to the environment. So this crisis supposedly and disasters then are very good because they allow us to make these judgments, and they become a certain form of critique themselves, or they can enable our critiques of a particular condition of a particular political ecology that might be engendering disasters. And so to make things a little bit relevant, it's really interesting throughout the pandemic. and especially after doing this review of the literature and becoming engaged in this topic, I've become really perceptive of the ways that people speak about the pandemic or speak about hurricanes or disasters as revelatory moments. And what's really interesting is that as an ethnographer or as an anthropologist, I don't even have to ask people the question where a disaster is revelatory. People volunteer this information. So a recent article from the New York Times either reveals two Louisianas, once with storm walls and another without. Again, this whole idea that the storm is revealing this for us. There are these tremendous inequities in hurricane protection. But so on the one hand, there are those anthropologists who say, and it's interesting because disaster anthropologist, even Tony himself, was a little skeptical of my use of the concept of crisis. But in the end, implicit within his scholarship, he does mobilize, or he implicitly mobilizes all of the classical meanings of crisis, in that suggests that it's actually that crisis is good to think, at least methodologically. But there are also anthropologists who are very critical of the term, in particular Janet Roitman. That's why her book is titled Anticrisis. And one of the things that Roitman is concerned with is, and I guess two things to separate here. One of the things we could separate is whether crisis is a legitimate or valuable heuristic or analytical device for social theorists and historians. And another thing to keep in mind is that might be a completely or somewhat different thing from the ways in which crisis is used in contemporary political culture, particularly in the United States. So Roitman has major issues with crisis, and I think Roitman, if I had to make my judgment of her book, is suggesting that crisis is not good to think, particularly because she feels that the ways in which crisis is mobilized in political discourse in the United States, it becomes more of an ideological instrument, meaning that when political leaders use the concept of crisis within their speeches, they are often providing the public with a particular way of making a crisis understandable, and that way of making the crisis understandable is not a critique. It actually serves to perpetuate either the epistemological system or the political system that actually engendered that crisis. And so in writing about Anticrisis, writing about the housing recession and housing crash and global recession and the aftermath, Roitman makes the judgment, makes the analysis that the epistemological changes that would be necessary to prevent similar economic catastrophes from happening again didn't take place. That we continue to think about housing as an asset, as a particular type of economic resource, but in debt as a particular type of asset for certain economic players, that were the conditions of possibility for that particular housing crisis, and those things were not radically rethought. The epistemological shift that would be needed to make sure that that doesn't happen again or to prevent its happening again didn't take place. And that the very discourse of crisis that was used to talk about and analyze the recession of 2008 ensured that the epistemological shifts that were needed and to change the ways that we think about housing economy, the capitalist housing economy in the United States did not take place. And we could also apply that, for example, to immigration. And one of the interesting things is, this story from NPR that has a wonderful 15-minute video of President Barack Obama well before Donald J. Trump, talking about the immigration crisis at the border. And he does precisely what Roitman critiques our political leaders for doing with the crisis concept. In the way in which President Obama mobilized the idea that there was a crisis in immigration at the border, maintain the status quo that actually created conditions of possibility for that migration. The destabilization of Central American nation states during the Cold War, the absence of a process of reconstruction in the aftermath. I think Jeffrey Cohen, I was reading one of his articles today about neoliberalism, neoliberal policies and migration. The way that neoliberal policies have pulled the social safety net and carpet what little there was in Central American nations and Mexico, that it also drives people to migrate. All of those things are kept out of the equation when migration is represented to Americans as a crisis. Instead, the United States of America is represented as being the moral legitimacy or the moral authority of the world. And if we are to take these people in, it's through an act of our own kindness. And if these people, and at the same time, in this speech, Obama represents transnational migrants as criminally dubious, suspicious people that must become good citizen subjects, that must learn English, that must go to the back of the line and wait for their turn in the context of the United States. So in that particular instance, Roitman would say, aha, see, I told you so. This is precisely how political leaders use the crisis concept. So one of the arguments and one of the concerns that Roitman has is that crisis thinking requires certain kinds of amnesia, certain types of forgetting, and crisis thinking, particularly in the political sphere of the US, ensures that the practices that engender the crisis remain, and that this whole idea that she proposes, that what is needed is an epistemological shift, the ways in shifting our thinking about migration, shifting our thinking about capitalism, that those have not taken place. And that the political mobilization of the crisis concept is deeply rooted in that. But so I was reading through this through this literature and thinking about what to say, and thinking particularly about my own work. One of the things that began to concern me was that when distinguished figures like Anthony Oliver Smith talk about disasters being revelatory crises, that they were being very self-referential. And this also came from longtime engagement with this senior generation of disaster anthropologists, that often I have been in multiple conference rooms where Tony gets very upset about the fact that if we figured out how disasters take form, why disasters occur, and we recognize that disasters are not these exogenous events that are completely outside of society, that we can't prevent, that all we can do is respond to emergence. And if we understand that there is processes of colonialism, of development, of inequity formation, that social practices play a huge role in shaping disasters, why do they persist? And to me, one of the things that I always wanted to respond to Tony, but I never did, out of respect, I suppose, or I just didn't want to create too much havoc, is that, well, that's because you're in your thought, you're assuming that everyone's going to witness and interpret disaster from a vantage point of a political ecology trained anthropologist, or from an anthropologist trained in vulnerability theory. And the people who are involved in engendering the conditions of possibility for disasters are by and large not anthropologists. So then my question becomes, who are the multiple beholders of crisis? My concern became that a lot of the writing from vulnerability theory, political ecology, that engages in this moaning and groaning about why do we still have disasters, was again being very self-referential and very univocal. There was only the voice of the anthropologists that mattered here in their interpretation. And that led me to think, well, who are the myriad actors who are involved in beholding disasters, in making, and that came all from my field work in disaster context, looking at expert actors in disaster affected populations who are themselves incredibly economically and socially, racially, culturally, and ethnically diverse. The variety of ways, the multivocality, in the tremendous diversity in the, for lack of a better concept, epistemological vantage points from which people beheld disasters. To me, that led me to think that we need to start asking another question, not just why do disasters persist, but also begin to wonder, well, if anthropologists aren't the only people beholding, narrating, and representing disasters, who are the other folks who are beholding them? And this goes back, perhaps, maybe thinking a little bit about Michel Foucault's The Order of Things, that famous painting that he begins Las Meninas with, the fact that we always have to keep in mind who the representer is. And we always had to acknowledge the fact that for lack of a better word, cosmological, epistemic perspective, culturally situated perspective of the beholder shapes in great ways what they see, how they see it, how they narrate, how to represent it. So I became really interested in, if we begin to diversify this question and transform this concern or this complaint into an ethnographic research question, what do we get? And the question then being, what does crisis reveal for whom, and who gets to represent that crisis? So I've been trying, I've had a couple of projects where I try to put this into practice to see what I get. And to see what new kinds of answers we come up with, and what kind of new insights do we come up with for trying to theorize and understand social change in the aftermath of crisis or during a crisis. And so in 2017, I'm very grateful to the National Science Foundation. I got a little grant, me and Rajaswamy from University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and we went to Houston with undergraduate and graduate students from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, and where I was at the time, and UTK. And we decided that we wanted to capture the multivocality. We wanted to ask, what did Hurricane Harvey reveal for whom? And to understand and to appreciate and to try to apprehend the diversity, the polylocality, the understanding that Houston is one of the most populous areas, densely populated areas of the United States. It's incredibly socially, economically, racially, culturally diverse. We were wondering who is beholden to disaster and how are they interpreting it? Of course, we only got a sample. We only got about $180,000. It would be nice to have a couple of $1 million to make this a more systematized and extensive project. We'll see if NSF ever is convinced to do that for us. But we got some really interesting responses. And so I'll start with one. I want to give you in the few times that I have. I'm at 38 minutes, trying to keep it at around 45. As we began our conversation with Houstonians of various socioeconomic stations in life, and for our sampling frame, we used civil society organizations, we used neighborhood associations, which again are not necessarily fully representative of the diversity of places, but they're good starting points from which to do Snowball sampling from. Some of the residents that we met, we began to ask this question, and we engaged in what I would call purposive Snowball sampling. We used Snowball sampling, but we also knew that there was a certain level of diversity in terms of gender, sexuality, age, ethnicity, again, migration status, and we wanted to capture as much as we could of that diversity. But we also wanted to capture the perspectives of elites, and sometimes elites offer those perspectives to us without having to ask. So here I give you Leo Limbeck III. I apologize, I wrote that in Spanish. I don't know, must have been a Spanish slip there. An example of neoliberal epistemology. What happens when the beholder of a disaster is not an anthropologist trained in political ecology? How are they going to perceive and interpret a disaster? And what's really interesting is Leo Limbeck III is the CEO of Aquinas Companies, one of the largest construction companies in Houston, who has a vested interest, a financial interest in continuing to build and develop the floodplain of Houston in a way that transforms hurricanes and storms into disasters. But he's not just an agent in the private sector. What's really interesting is that Limbeck has had multiple appointments at schools of businesses, and I think his latest appointment is at Stanford. So he's also an academic, he's also a scholar, but a very different type of scholar. And what was fascinating to me is that in the aftermath of Harvey, he wrote this editorial for the Houston Chronicle titled Hurricane Harvey Was Not a Catastrophe. And he wrote, Hurricane Harvey was not a catastrophe. It was Houston's finest hour. Evidence that our distinctive approach to self-governance works, even under the stress of a major storm. So his argument was what I would call this neoliberal necropolitical calculus. He said, we only 89 people died. Sure, we lost $160 billion, but most of that will be covered by insurance. The city only lost about 10% of its GDP. The real risk, and what the naysayers are saying, the political ecologists, the disaster anthropologists, is that we're going to rethink our neoliberal approach to urban development. And what's really at risk here is the replication of capital. So what's fascinating to me is, of course, I don't think Leo Limbeck is correct in that. But we also have to understand that neoliberalism is an epistemology for people, right? It's a way of understanding or ordering and structuring the world, of making knowledge, of processing it. And that in fact, the academy is deeply involved in the creation of this thinking, right? So sometimes political ecology or vulnerability anthropologists begin to complain about the fact that people perceive disasters in certain ways, but they kind of forget that the academy in the certain sectors of the academy are actually deeply invested in the production of neoliberal thought, right? So you have competing epistemologies even within the academy itself. It's not a challenge of the academics versus the greedy private sector. The academic sector is also involved in actually developing neoliberalism as a particular way of processing information. And what became really interesting to me in the aftermath of Houston is that for people like Limbeck, rather than being there was an epistemological shift, but it's not necessarily the radical one that we would expect. There was actually what I would call an epistemological intensification. The crisis and disaster served as proof positive that neoliberalism works. What has actually been shaping the disaster through this type of necropolitical calculus. And we have to take it seriously. We can't just dismiss it as, oh, that's just a cynicism of a company owner. We have to recognize that these are the profoundly felt and adhered to forms of knowledge that are constantly run into people who are proponents of the merits of capitalist forms of thought, capitalist types of calculus. We have to tackle it and take it seriously at the level of knowledge, of contested knowledges, if we're going to really figure out why disasters persist and what we're up against. But it was really interesting that other residents of the city of Houston actually thought like anthropologists. They were lay anthropologists. As a matter of fact, Janice Brooks is one of the people who we had the pleasure of meeting, who is actually a trained archaeologist. And we forget that there are lots of people with anthropology degrees who unfortunately couldn't get academic jobs, so they're part of the populace. And Janice is a trained archaeologist, and in a way, the narratives that I elicited from her, and when I asked her the question, what did Harvey reveal for you, were a perfect political ecological analysis, what some anthropologists would call the lay expert. And one of the things that it revealed for her, or that it provided proof, was that she shared examples of maps in terms of which structures were affected. For her, the damage and the fact that the majority of the structures damaged during Harvey were structures that were outside of the 100-year floodplain. And due to the fact that the 100-year floodplain has been so heavily affected by poorly regulated, what Leo Limbeck III is calling our finest hour, and is calling our formula for success, Houston's formula for success systematically creates flood risk. And in the fact that the flood maps and the damage maps revealed for her what she knew all along, and provided great evidence that indeed the floodplain of Houston had been so deeply affected by for-profit development that the disaster occurred. So here she goes, saying, much of the flooding during Harvey and tax day happened outside of the designated floodplain. Our storm drain system and our development standards have not kept up. Our storm drain system does not function like it is represented. The Army Corps of Engineers releases the maps, but the maps are politicized in terms of where risk is demonstrated. And really quickly, just to give some more diversity, there's lots that I could get. I guess another interesting narrative that we elicited from another one of these lay anthropologists, this particular interlocutor, Katie Jones, is a lawyer. And what was interesting is that when we asked her, what did Harvey reveal for you? She didn't want to talk about Harvey. She wanted to talk about the previous storm that she had lived through, Tropical Storm Allison, which was the revelatory crisis for her. And Katie at that time was in law school. She was a single mother. She had 3 children. And she had managed to pull enough resources to buy a historic home in Houston. But in terms of her gaze and her epistemology, flood risk was not something that she saw or that she was concerned about. She told us during our ethnographic interviews that that first home that she bought, she didn't realize that she was buying in a flood-prone zone, and she didn't realize that she was buying it directly adjacent to a flood wall. And she tells us, I thought that flood wall was ornamental. And she blames herself. She says, I was so naive thinking that it was a pretty ornamental wall when in fact it was clear evidence that this is a flood risk zone. Her home flooded, and one of the things that I want to talk about, perhaps as we close, is the role of affect, because a lot of the emphasis, for example, that Reutemann places is on this idea of epistemological shift, and that begins to sound like a very mentalistic way of thinking about the changes that take place, where change takes place, and how change is driven. And one of the things that I'm going to close by trying to have us reflect on, that I want to pursue as I continue to write about this, is the relationship between seeing, feeling, sensing, thinking, and change. And for her, what changed her gaze, what changed her sight, was the trauma of being incredibly economically vulnerable as a single mother in law school, having, for most Americans, their home is the largest investment they will ever make, and feeling herself responsible for making what she thought was a bad home purchasing decision, and seeing that destroyed by a flood and the tremendous precarity she was placed in. That profound trauma that is lived and felt, I think, I hypothesize from the research, from the interviews that we did with her, is what drove her to change. And it reiterates what is discussed by affect theories, the fact that affect is a primary mover of social action. In the same way, I suspect that Leo Limbeck III's editorial is panicked. It's reactionary in the sense of his fear of losing the mechanisms of capital reproduction that are not just things that are thought of in terms of cold hard facts, but are also deeply felt, which I think is a conversation that's a little missing from, again, discussions of change in the aftermath of crises. And just as a final example, is the fact that in East Houston, we found an even more interesting narrative, which was that when we began to, the lay or the local anthropologists that were these college-educated, predominantly white civil society leaders, gave us these narratives that were perfect political ecology and perfect vulnerability theory. But when we stepped outside of that little bubble and we went to East Houston, there's an area that's historically marginalized, predominantly populated by African-American and Latinx people who are low-level service sector workers, extremely economically marginalized. We got a very different analysis. And particularly when we were interviewing historically disenfranchised working class African Americans, one of the explanations that people all constantly gave us was when we asked them, why do you think Hurricane Harvey became the disaster that it did? We got accustomed that the emerging theme was the idea that it was God's will. And what's interesting about this is that in my own disaster research, a lot of the, of course, vulnerability theory and political ecology often work against the idea that disasters are an act of nature or an act of God. And often, for example, being friends with many of my disaster colleagues in other parts of Latin America, they often express much frustration whenever a religious figure attributes a disaster to divine intervention or to a divine force or to divine punishment, which I admit is problematic. In the United States, for example, Franklin Graham said that Hurricane Katrina was God's punishment for all the sexual licentiousness and homosexuality present in New Orleans, which of course, very problematic and politicized religious narrative of causation of the disaster. But people's mobilization of divine intervention or divine action in Houston, particularly amongst working class African Americans, while may look on the surface to be identical, it's actually quite different. And that required a little bit of further participant observation on our part. When we began to hear these narratives, and we began to interview people about the importance of their churches in their social life and in their everyday life and their community life. We asked pastors for permission to attend the services of our interlocutors. And one of the interesting things that became apparent over the course of the sermons that we heard was that when these working class African Americans in Houston were saying it was God's will, that's actually a narrative about the history and the arbitrariness of the structural racism they have faced over many generations. And a particular example was one pastor giving a sermon on a particular psalm of the Bible of walking through the valley of the shadow of death, where he was telling his parishioners or his congregation members, basically in coded terms, that as African Americans, and I agree, structural racism is completely arbitrary, and in that they must suffer it, they must endure it. And in a way, that was one of the very coded ways in which people were talking about the disaster. In a way, it was a narrative about racial injustice. So anyway, I've already gone on for quite a while. I just want to end it up really quick. So just coming back to the question of epistemological change, how and why, that particular case study in Houston, and I want to make a case here for a continuing engagement of anthropology with ethnography and with fieldwork, because it allows us to answer questions empirically and highly theoretical questions. And so one of the things that had not been considered before when talking about disasters such as revelatory crises is that in particularly the frustration that epistemological change hasn't taken place, we have to also consider the role of epistemological intensification, as we see in the case of Leland III, and also this relationship between trauma, affect, and change. And that puts me at 51 minutes. Really in closing, I just want to say that this whole narrative or this whole trope of, or not maybe trope is not the right word, but narrating disasters as revelatory events and crises has continued to surface through the pandemic, and I find it really interesting. So in New Orleans, where I am now, Leticia Casildo, for example, who is an amazing grassroots organizer, Garifuna Honduran, whose organization, Familias Unidas en Acción, is reaching out and helping those who are most vulnerable in disasters these days, Central American migrants in the city of New Orleans, kept on telling me in the first conversation, without me even bringing up the issue of revelatory crises, she kept on saying what the pandemic has revealed, at least for her, is the tremendous precarity and marginalization of migrants who don't have a formalized immigration status with the U.S. immigration authorities. Again, that whole idea of revelation, right? So certainly the current pandemic crises remain food for thought and important and critical methodological moments. Thank you.
Okay. Here we go. We are unshared, and I'm trying to start video. So questions from our audience. I don't have any yet in my chat, but maybe if somebody has something for the floor. Well, let me launch one. How do we handle, Roberto, the calculus of if we take a Janet Reutemann where there are no crises, then in a certain sense she is modeling that on the political framework in which crises are constructed. But then there are things that we objectively have to call a crisis, and wars break out, and earthquakes happen. So how do we handle the kind of tangible side from the tangible, in the case of natural disasters, where do we in that calculus of what is and what isn't a crisis, where do we draw the line?
I maintain that the crisis is good to think, both in the critical sense and reflective sense of the history of the concept and its blind sides, but also the fact that people constantly volunteer information, such as Leticia Casiudo saying, that's what the pandemic has revealed for me. And the other thing is, one of the interesting things, again, is that despite all the pushback that I got from disaster anthropologists about the merits of the crisis concept, it's the fact that if we can maybe take out the teleological assumptions of the concept, I really like the classic Greek meanings of the term, because, for example, the pandemic has been full of judgment and decisions. My significant other and I right now are having to decide, we like to ride bicycles for fun, and we have been incredibly isolated. We came to New Orleans and the pandemic numbers began to go down. We got vaccinated and we started riding bicycles with a group of New Orleans cyclists. And now with the Delta variant resurging and befriending some of these cyclists online on Facebook, coming to find out they're anti-vaxxers, we have had to make this decision. Are we going to continue to cycle with them? We have an invitation tonight to go cycle, and we are both challenged with this decision. We got to make a decision that could cost us our lives or could cost somebody else their lives, right? So crises are certainly moments of decision. They are certainly moments of judgment. We're all judging each other, right? The fact that wearing a mask is now a subject of judgment. So I maintain that we must remain reflexive about the pitfalls, the blind sides of the crisis concept. But I also think that it's not necessarily helpful to completely do away with the concept. The other thing is that yes, things of substance are happening in the world. So although I gather that Reutemann's critique is really, and maybe if I were Janet Reutemann and I were writing Anticrisis, I would make it explicit that my critique is of the ways in which the crisis concept is used by political leaders, but the crisis itself as an object of analysis, she's still doing the anthropology of crisis. We need to be doing the anthropology of crisis. And again, it becomes almost as in, anthropology's relationship towards culture and whether we reify or not, right? Anthropologists at first with a culture concept created this concept as a heuristic device that eventually gained a life of its own and began to be misused. And now there are anthropologists who do the anthropology of the use of the concept. And that is in itself part of the anthropology of crisis. And again, it's not to say that we can't, people's houses did get foreclosed on in 2008, right? Tangible material things that weren't happening prior to 2008 did too happen. Right? So things of substance are occurring. What do you want to call that, right? And I think the same applies for disasters because, and again, I think that the challenge or the apprehension, part of the apprehension that Reutemann has, is that the use of the term crisis is very similar to the way that disaster was used prior to the emergence of vulnerability theory and the political ecology of disasters, which was disasters used to be thought of as unpreventable moments that had nothing to do with the order of society, that were completely, that you could not prepare for, that you could not preventively mitigate, that were either acts of God or acts of nature, and the best that you could do was respond to them. So in that way, disasters were not a critique of your human environment relations that had shaped them. And in a way, and in that way, perhaps crisis theory and crisis anthropology could benefit from disaster anthropology in the sense that that when disaster anthropologists began to redefine how we thought about disasters, they didn't toss out the word disaster. They continued to do the research of disaster, but what they engage in is an anthropological redefinition of what disaster is. And
Okay.
perhaps it's one of the things that we got to be thinking about crisis, right?
Right. So Jeff, go fire it up. You had a question.
Thanks, Roberto. That was so wonderfully interesting. I so appreciated it. So I actually, what you were just talking about brought up a second question that I think I want to go to, and it's where does sustainability fit in this picture that you're creating? Because if we're like rethinking what a crisis is and the response that at least some of the actors involved are looking towards, which is a sustainable kind of response, how does that play into the very way in which we're playing, that the different groups are playing with the very idea of what a crisis is or what a disaster is?
And, and I guess it also brings us to opening up the concepts of sustainability, right? Because one of the
and resilience. Maybe throw a few darts at resilience.
Yeah. And that's what I was going to bring up, that we're not even talking about sustainability anymore. Now we're talking about resilience, which some people suspect, some scholars suspect, is a distinctly neoliberal discourse for thinking about disasters that has completely thrown out the idea of prevention out the window. So I start with sustainability, right? Bringing in the work of people from science and technology studies, and a lot of work that's been done in terms of looking at material agency, and particularly the work of Andrew Pickering, is the fact that the world is certainly not a stable place, right? So the idea of sustainability upholds the notion of equilibrium, of stasis. When in fact, what we know from science and technology studies is the fact that with the intensification of, and I'm not saying that we're the only ones with technology, that non-modern societies didn't have technology, but certainly the proliferation of technologies, the world is constantly in flux, right? So sustainability is an interesting perspective, but we had to understand that maybe redefine it, understanding that we're in a world of constant emergence where nothing is stable, right? Those are some of the critiques of Roy Rappaport's Human Ecology, right? That it upheld this notion of equilibrium, that in fact that's not what ecosystems are. So there's certainly a need to rethink ecosystems. And yes, to follow up on what John mentioned, the emergence of the concept of resilience, which resilience is beginning, and certainly in governmental speak, in agency speak, has come to completely opaque both sustainability and disaster risk reduction and vulnerability. And it's really dangerous because, well, not dangerous, it's really powerful in a very problematic way, in a way that radioactive power is powerful. It can either kill you or you can harness it to, in the sense that, for example, I was recently put under contract by the Virgin Islands Territorial Emergency Management Agency and FEMA and the University of Virgin Islands to help come up with a social dimension of the natural hazards, resilience, and disaster mitigation plan for the territory. And it was amazing how much resilience got thrown around, yet how poorly theorized or conceptualized the concept was. It's a waste bin for whatever you want it to be, in part. The other element of resilience, which is more nefarious, perhaps, is the idea that it's part of a Hayekian neoliberal mode of thought, where Holling comes up with the concept of the idea that resilience, Holling was particularly interested in thinking about resilience of how do we get a species to not go extinct under conditions of capitalist exploitation, and understand in his proposal that we need to look at multiple variables and multiple interspecies relationships that allowed either for a school of fish to not be overfished, etc. And then Hayek kind of hijacks that and begins to make the claim, and his particular analogy, that economic systems are like hydrological systems, that you shouldn't control them through the fixing of prices or the fixing of the cost of labor, that they're so complex that they're self-regulating and you must let them go, and that the best that we can do is be resilient. And resilience means not attempting to prevent the disaster, but in putting the right players in place so that when disaster does occur, you have the human intellect and the resourcefulness to respond. So more and more, the idea then becomes, although while vulnerability theory created a proposition or the possibility that disasters were preventable, resilience thinking is saying, forget about preventing. all we can do is respond. And what we need to do is have the right agents in place, the right type of social and cultural capital in place. The problem with that is that you get into all kinds of issues of exclusion, right? The problem with that is in the case of New Orleans, right? The fact that we come to call neoliberal thinking resourceful, inventive, market-driven solutions at the expense of other things like racial justice, social justice. So the stakes are huge.
So we have a question from the floor from Tyler. Tyler, you want to open up and ask your question?
Sure. I just wanted to ask about with the example of Lou Anne Simmons from the book, there you can feel like the impending like cloud of another disaster coming, it feels like, with another chance for a flood. And then along with your example too of anti-vaxxers, like there's always going to be the cloud of what if you actually get sick hanging over your head. And I was just curious what you have to say about like not necessarily convincing people of the impending danger, but like of how do you work with societally, how do you work with people that like feel like it would be taking something away from them to be able to prepare for something. Like she got her dream home, but there's always going to be the chance that it gets destroyed, but she's just willing to live with that chance.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And, you know, one of the things that I think about is, and maybe I'll start with the anti-vaxxers, right? And again, I haven't conducted systematized research on this. It'd be wonderful. I wish that we all had open credit accounts with NSF and we could just do whatever research we want, but that's not. But you know, one of the things, in just my own personal experience of doing my own participant observation through the pandemic with anti-vaxxers, is to understand that there are multiple reasons why people choose to not vaccinate. There are people who are in, you know, on the one hand, you have ultra-conservative, predominantly white folks who might choose to not vaccinate, but you also have people of color who are not vaccinating. And sometimes it's for very different reasons, right? The fact that amongst African-American, this historically disenfranchised, marginalized Latinos and African-American folks, there are good reasons, like the Tuskegee study. And there's a long-standing memory. It's not just Tuskegee that happened in the early 20th century. It's, you know, recently there's been studies showing how, and getting back into affect, the fact that African-American women are allowed to suffer more in hospitals, that they're less likely to be given painkillers, that they're more likely to die because they didn't get, because effectively and inadvertently racist healthcare providers do not consider the pain of a Black woman the same way they might consider the pain of a white woman. So many people of color, unfortunately, have very good reasons for being very angry and very skeptical. And I've run into a lot of that here in New Orleans, right? So you have to understand that people come at this from very different reasons, at this anti-vaxxing, for example. And when we get into the question of how do you bring people into the fold, because I for my own personal reasons, I do believe, I do support vaccination. I myself am vaccinated. I think it's a great thing. I think people need to get vaccinated. But it gets us back into perhaps a challenge of crisis thinking and disaster thinking in the non-anthropological way. But now we're concerned with low rates of vaccination, but now it's too late. This is a problem that we have refused to engage, and it has to do with the fact that, and even looking at Houston, right? And forgive me if I go off on a huge tangent here, but when Emil Durkheim wrote The Division of Labor in Society, he was very much concerned that capitalist systems of production broke down solidarity. And Durkheim was not a critique of capitalism. He was a supporter of it, but he just thought that social science could contribute tremendously to enhancing how it worked. And that capitalism, like an internal combustion engine, has certain undesired side effects, which is, again, enemy and alienation. So Durkheim recommended that state governments should be in the business of creating institutions, right? Lay types of religion that would integrate people into the fold and create solidarity. And I do think that's an important thing to keep in mind. The more, when I look at Houston, the more that I look at neoliberal forms of governance, where we have sacrificed society for the purpose of capital reproduction. The fact that we, and it's a highly politicized issue, right? We need to fund public education. We need to fund programs that integrate people. We need to create the solidarity and coherence long before the virus presents itself, right? It's too late now. I mean, the part of the problem is our short attention spans, our lack of political will, right? Creating solidarity, creating cohesion, reinstating, on the one hand, as someone who has read science and technology studies, I understand the need to think critically about science, but to understand that thinking critically about technoscience is very different from succumbing to conspiracy theory, right? But that requires investments. That requires the idea that society is something that needs to be built. Within a neoliberal perspective, society just happens organically, right? Just let it be. And within the Durkheimian perspective, society needs to be built. And we've gone back on our obligation to build it. And we need to start building it, building solidarity systems, educational systems, investments. Yes, John. Oh, sorry, I can't hear you.
David Stebbin has a question that centers on Houston. So David, why don't you fire up?
Thanks.
Frozen. Okay. I don't think it's going to work. I guess not. David, are you there?
Did you read my question then? Yeah,
I'll read it. I'm not okay. Given the use Houston as an example, the state of Texas recently changed its voting laws in ways to likely reduce the political influence of those most adversely affected by disasters like Harvey. How do you think? What are your thoughts on distortions in the political process for how crises are understood and perhaps generated? David, now you're back with us. Is that a fair?
Right. I mean, Houston is a special case, and Texas is something of an extreme case.
Okay, I think we lost you again. Any thoughts on the politics side of this question?
Yes, and I think it goes back to your interpretation of my work, John, which was, I think, spot on, right? Understanding that the crisis remains a political process, that we can't just lay back and expect the crisis will guarantee that everything will turn out well. It requires our engagement. And yes, I think what David was pointing to that he got caught up was that Houston is a tremendously progressive, right? It's a very blue city within a very red state. And I think that takes us back to what passes for democracy in the United States, right? That we have institutionalized what we call corruption in other countries. We have institutionalized in the United States through things like campaign contributions, lobbying, right? Where the will of the public, the will of the many is superseded by the will of those who have economic influence. And this is the case of Houston. It's the fact that in the case of Houston, and that's one of the narratives that emerged from some Houstonians and interlocutors, that the financial power of construction companies and real estate development companies who flood political campaigns for mayor, and then the mayor ends up being the person who appoints people to the city planning commission, who can then grant those companies exceptions to what little actual regulations concerning flooding exists, right? So, and I think that remains a matter of the political nature and the political ontology of disasters. And I think I hate to say it, it puts our democracy in crisis, right? And I think that that's something that many Americans are deeply frustrated with across the political spectrum. The role that energy companies particularly play in a way that the will of the people can be superseded by these powerful economic agents. And I think it brings back, so it takes us back to this whole issue of, one of the things that I point out, thinking about the pandemic, right? If we took the Salin's perspective, and Salin said, well, if change comes to the pandemic, it's because the American mode of production finally reached its maturity. But what if economic elites, conservative elites, have all kinds of tools at their disposal and all kinds of resources at their disposal to put that mode of production that's supposedly mature, to put it on life support, right? So misinformation, right? Twitter, social media, right?
Right.
Conspiracy theories. And that brings back the human agent into understanding why things go a certain way and not other. And I think a good analytical model for thinking about that is actor network theory from science and technology studies, thinking about historians of science, how Bruno Latour narrates the history of of anthrax vaccines in the pasteurization of France, right? That you got to understand these different actors, the ways that they enroll different agents at that very dynamic moment that requires ethnographic type work, anthropological type work to understand why a particular crisis ended in a particular way and not another.
I must admit, I'm sitting here thinking about the geography of the country and the density of social connections and political processes, and asking the heretical thought of what if. I think about. I'll use New York State. I won't use Massachusetts because Massachusetts hasn't had a disaster. But what if you were living and working in the city of New York versus the city of New Orleans? Question is, would you in fact be working on disaster? But meanwhile, they've had a disaster. I mean, anyway, I'm thinking about there are parts of this country where the density of response and in the sense of a community development is so far beyond what's happening in Louisiana and Texas. I hate to be so rude, and those have deep historical roots running deep into the 18th century. So anyway, I just, but on the other hand, we have a disproportionate impact of disasters, exogenous disasters, on the most exposed part of the country, with the greatest lack of social infrastructure, failure to develop social infrastructure, running back 400 years.
Yeah, and with anthropogenic climate change, it's also the fact that areas that were supposed to be pretty stable, right? Like the floods that happened recently in Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, that really caught a lot of people by surprise, right? In Ida, apparently killed more people in New York this time than the Gulf Coast. Of course, the destruction that we saw on the Gulf Coast is extensive, but it seems like the loss of human life was even greater, right? So,
well, that was because they were just completely. No storm will ever come off the land. Come on, and it was. But yeah, the question is how does New Jersey? I think it'd be interesting to go to New Jersey and see how they. I mean, it's 45 people were killed in New Jersey. That's the life. That's the big. What are those counties? How do those counties responding? And is there any difference between that and what's going on the ground in places like Houston?
Yeah,
maybe not. Maybe not.
Yeah, no, and I'm sure that there are important differences, right? And that's why I'm a big proponent of doing underground ethnographic work. I won't mention any names to protect the guilty, but in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, Martha Ward, an anthropologist from the University of New Orleans, asked a very prominent disaster anthropologist that subscribes to the vulnerability theory approach whether they were going to come to New Orleans to do research and to do ethnography. And this anthropologist said in a somewhat pedantic way, we already know how disasters happen, so we don't need to go and do field work. And I disagree with that. I insist that no, there will be important differences, and that's why we need to go there and do research on the ground. And the National Science Foundation needs to have the flexibility to give us funding so we can get this work done. Paging
Well,
and stuff. Yes.
I hope we can jog them loose through this conversation. Let me just see if there are any other issues out there. I don't see anything else in our chat. Anybody want to jump in? We have a question from Kyle on neoliberalism. Kyle, do you want to jump in?
Let's see if this is working. Let's see. Hold on. Hello.
Yep, we can hear you. Yep,
Okay.
you can open your video if you want, but if not, that's cool.
Yeah, I've tried. It's not. I don't know. It's not really. Anyway, thank you for the talk. I just wanted to say everybody put it together. Roberto is excellent. Hearing everything you had to say. Thanks for sharing today. So my question, I'll try to keep it short. There are some things that were really interesting to me that you said about neoliberalism as an ideology and in general, just political ideology. And my question is kind of about how it stands very close to the concept of solidarity and crisis reaction, and in a way, the way that it stands next to solidarity is in a juxtaposed way. It seems because as an ideology, it is more so about individualism. It's a proponent of individualism. And so solidarity with a diverse community and an ideology which is a big proponent of individualism kind of stands as a, there's a challenge there, right? How do you work with that? And I'm wondering if, just based off of some of those core tenets of those ideologies, with it being neoliberalism and solidarity, if neoliberalism it needs to be more reflexive of its challenges with solidarity, right? And really challenges with diversity, right? A diverse community, right? And I'm wondering, if crisis is something that we can look at as how neoliberalism is not necessarily using crisis as a reflexive tool of itself, but more so as a tool of media and politics to perpetuate itself. If that's a place where we can start to shift our thinking about neoliberalism as an ideology as something that needs to be more reflexive.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And, I guess as an anthropologist, I also like to go, and that's why we do field work, right? Because the answers to these questions are best borne out in practice. And, so certainly that individualism is part, but I think, but I think another part of neoliberalism is a certain type of systemic thought. And particularly as Hayek proposed it, and he used nature as a supposed mirror for neoliberalism, the idea that there are individual choices taking place, but there's also this broader macro individual process at play that is supposedly self-regulating, like an ecosystem. And thinking about how that way of thought was applied in New Orleans post-Katrina, my concern is not only that certainly that could be a part, bringing a greater concern with the collective. But in post-Katrina New Orleans, and to begin with the fact that often proponents of neoliberal thought don't necessarily even call it neoliberal thought, right? They call it things like best practice. And it's me, the anthropologist, making the judgment. And that's why, again, I love those classical meanings of crisis, because we do make judgments in our work, making that judgment that is in itself a neoliberal discourse. So an example of that is in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, the majority of public housing units in the city were only marginalized, minimally damaged. And yet the Housing Authority of New Orleans and HUD took that as an opportunity to permanently close and demolish 50% of those public housing units with the intention of privatizing that real estate. And in the process, displaced 111,000 African Americans from the city. There were nearly a quarter of the population of the city who never came back. And when residents of the city of New Orleans pushed back against that idea, saying, you told us that this is a participatory planning process. Therefore, if you ask me what I want you to reopen the public housing back, because we can't have participatory planning if the residents of public housing aren't back. They are legitimate residents of the city as well. And the so-called disaster recovery experts that participated in the UNOP housing, the UNOP recovery planning process, the Lambert recovery planning process in New Orleans, responded that the federal government would not invest 5 cents in a program that didn't offer a 25-cent return. And for me, that's a distinct logic, right? So it's individualism is part of it, but it's also these logics of fiscal cost benefit analysis, and of course, which are quite partial, because if we found out as we went along, it's the fact that the free market, the so-called free market system, the so-called neoliberal system, is supported by the public sector. So it's not that the government retreats; it's just that the central government switches its funding priorities. That the funding doesn't go towards public services; instead, it goes to support and to provide a lifeline or to support the private sector. That's why some people argue it's more corporatism than neoliberalism. But in the case of New Orleans, we found out that these areas that are seen to be economically unproductive are actually quite economically productive. It's a fact that in that public housing, that's where all the low-level service sector workers live. And the fact that we represent it as in it's these African-American folks, these social undesirables who are getting a public handout, when in fact it's the private sector having its labor force on life support at the cost of the federal government, right? And after that, the crisis was that McDonald's and Burger King's couldn't find people to work for them. They were given $5,000 sign-up bonuses for workers because they couldn't get enough workers. In the aftermath, during the pandemic, the same thing is happening now with this so-called labor shortage, right? Which is pretty interesting. So I think, I mean, searching individualism is part of it, but there's a lot more at stake. And what we can't ignore, it's also the replication of capital. So if that is perceived to be at stake, and again, and I guess the thing, part of the other definition of neoliberalism is that the idea that market deregulation will lead to optimal social ends, and that that cost benefit the financial cost benefit analysis and these kind of rubrics of calculation are the mechanism for social well-being. And what we have seen with the rise of neoliberalism is a tremendous and egregious rise in inequity, right, in the United States, right? When Barack Obama left office, he wrote an article for The Economist using Department of Labor figures saying that in the 1970s, the average American laborer made a 25th, or the average CEO made 25 times what the average laborer made. And when he left office, the average CEO was making 300 times, right? And so that egregious opulence, I mean, who needs $1 trillion for what, and at what cost? That is also a tremendous driver of neoliberal thought, which is, I don't know, I'm not going to be an academic right now, which is greed, perhaps masked as technocratic knowledge, in that's, I think, is much harder to combat.
Thank you for answering that and expanding on some of those core ideological tenets of neoliberalism, which are definitely systematic, economic, political. It's really important to think about it that way. Absolutely. I was just, I was wondering more so if you think then something like crisis and looking at how neoliberal proponents will use the concept of crisis to perpetuate their ideology, if that actually is going to produce solidarity, right? And so then can we instead think about crisis more so how you're talking about it, how you've spoken about it in this presentation, to critique our already ongoing efforts and things that have occurred in the past couple decades?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's precisely what I was talking about with a grad student. And, I feel horrible using his data to answer your question because he hasn't even written it up. But it's for the well-being, it's for the sake of knowledge, not for my own self-advancement here. But because one of the things that he was looking at, on the one hand, the neoliberal thought upholds the idea of resilience, right? And resilience becomes the answer. And it just accepts that disaster is going to happen. And disaster in crisis becomes also an opportune moment for more effective, resourceful reconfigurations of capital. So capital improves itself, which is kind of nefarious. And in the other aspect is an aspect of solidarity. And that is also very interesting. And that's precisely what the student is looking at. And so Jason von Medding from the University of Florida recently published a little op-ed video piece about the importance of mutual aid groups and mutual aid networks. And we're certainly seeing that. This particular grad student is looking at the community fridges program that started, I think, in California, and it's now spread also here in New Orleans. But one of the interesting things that the student is noticing is that we have to, it's on the one hand, there is this whole idea of communal and anarchic approach to aid. But one of the things that and that's why we need to do ethnography, because if we don't do ethnography, we can't know what actually happened. One of the things that he's noticing, though, is that just like any kind of political imaginary. On the one hand, there's the utopian imaginary, and then there's what happens in practice. And the utopian imaginary of the solidarity movements is that, for example, the community fridges, is that it's a fully anarchic system where everybody contributes to the fridge of food in the neighborhood and everybody can take out. But that's not what's happening in practice. So one of the things that we had to consider is that it's still subjects that I'm not going to say they're neoliberal subjects, but it's still subjects who are in one way or another entangled with neoliberalism, who are populating the supposedly communal approach. So the intention in the communities is not manifesting the solidarity in the cases that he's looking at. It's not manifesting in the ways in which they were idealized. So it's turning out that an example of that is the idea is that everyone within the community contributes to the fridge, but it's turning out there's only one or two people within a particular community who end up taking the brunt. A lot of people end up remaining individualized, right? So one or two people become the ones who become the sole bearers of the burden or of the effort of maintaining the fridge, right? So those are interesting observations that he's providing, right? That we also had to question. Yes, so there is an increasing discourse of solidarity, but we have to ask who are the subjects of those solidarity discourses, and sometimes the official self-representation of the movement doesn't match what's going on in practice. And the best way to find that out is through ethnographic work.
I think we have to stop. I thank you all. I thank you all for coming today. But we are way over time, and we've had some great perspectives today. I want to thank Roberto for taking the time to spend the afternoon with us, really, and or it may not be your afternoon, but thanks a lot.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone,
Okay.
for your attention.
Yep.